Kia ora. You're not allowed to say shut up. Is that Afghan, is it? Kia ora and greetings, and welcome to the latest version of the People's Republic of Christchurch. And welcome back to 2021. And I know many of you will be feeling that I'm looking slightly older, and it's true.
And thinner.
And thinner, says Margaret. You good, thank you. And I lost since Christmas nearly 3 kilos, but I found some of it last night. But look, it's great to be back, and we've got a number of really interesting speakers apart from tonight. For the that was a good one. Did you like it? Yeah. Hey, here's Councillor Major.
No, he's not.
Or Morga. If anyone needs a ditch dug, Phil will do it for you. You're lucky Chrissy Williams isn't here, she'd scratch your eyes out. Next week we've got Tamari Tau is coming, and Tamari is going to talk through the Ngāi Tahu High Court claim for the riverbed claim, which Ngāi Tahu have put. So, and my experience with Tamari is we won't be left in any doubt about what he feels on the topic. Nor will he feel he doesn't have to defend it. But look, tonight we've got a guy that I first met when he was 9, and he's been bossy since he was 9. I said to Pam, this kid's a leader, because he was the guy that was lining up all of the families so they could have their picture taken with the mayor after the citizenship ceremony, and the man that organised it and gave you is that elderly looking fella there. He looked a lot younger then, but mind you, when I think about it, so did you. But Abbas and I and Pam have stayed friends ever since with his family, and whenever he's got to certain crossroads in life, we've sat down and talked over a cup of coffee. And I think that he's Muslim. Halal beers. Tony, you didn't hear that? Yes, it's an old smash palace recipe. But one of the things that's I think one of the things that we really have to hit hard is the amazing energy and commitment and life that the refugee and migrant community bring into our country. And over the next little while, I'm going to continue that with my writings. We gain so much, and every single person in New Zealand, every single person is a descendant of an immigrant. Every single person. And we need to remember that. And the first Māori who came here, their journey was phenomenal. And a lot died on the way, just as Abbas's families did as well. And so we've got to remember that, and we've got to actually... We could be a laboratory for the world if we really are committed. And there are people here like Patrick who's devoted their lives to it, and we need to honour that. So tonight, I'd like to welcome my friend Abbas, and I'm sure you'll find him just as interesting as I do. So put your hands together.
Halal beer now, I see. When I got the invite to come speak here at the first Tuesday Club for the year, Gary sold it to me very well. He said, we'll start off with you, we'll set the bar very low, and then it'll only be upwards for the rest of the year. But no, with that first photo, when we first met Gary at the citizenship ceremony, the thing is nobody actually wanted a photo with this guy, so hey guys, come on, out of courtesy. Very good. Full chains on and everything. Yeah. Thanks so much for this invitation to speak. And I've spoken here once before after obviously March in 2019. I can't believe it's almost been 2 years since next month actually. But since then, a number of things have happened. Obviously, New Zealand has gone about trying to find some of the answers to some of those pressing questions. But when Gary said, come along and speak, I said, what do you want me to talk about? What would be interesting? And he said, well, what have you been up to for the last, year and a half, 2 years? And I thought, that would be a really interesting topic. So in August of 2019, I was lucky enough to be awarded a Fulbright scholarship to go and study in the United States of America. And for some of you who don't know, a Fulbright is a program that was launched after World War II by then, I think the former, then current US Secretary of State, to try and build bridges between the US and the rest of the world. Back then, it was a US-European thing, to send American students and academics and entrepreneurs over to Europe and vice versa. And since then, it's expanded to the rest of the world, obviously including Australia and New Zealand. As it stands, the program sends about, depending on the amount of funding, and I think as of 2019, it was doubled, which is why I got it, I think, otherwise. So there's more places available. But as of 2019, I think we send about between 20 and 30 students a year over there to the US, and then we receive just as many here. And it's not just students, who are like myself, who have gone to do master's studies or whatnot. It's a lot of scientists, and also a lot of teachers and entrepreneurs. So it's a two-way thing. When I was awarded the scholarship, they asked us, where did you want to go? What did you want to study? And after March, something that I thought that there was a particular gap of knowledge in the world, but particularly in New Zealand perhaps, is this understanding or lack of about how March came to be. This kind of this movement, this underbelly that had possibly been brewing a lot in overseas, particularly in the US and Europe, that had now found itself here in Otatahi, Christchurch. So I applied for programs that would focus on kind of terrorism, particularly domestic terrorism, and the best program, I guess, in the world, or it calls itself that, I don't know if it's true, is the Security Studies Program, the SSP, at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. When the SSP was launched way back in the 90s and early 2000s, security studies meant trying to understand jihadi terrorism. But over the last few years, it's pivoted to try and understand domestic terrorism, particularly white supremacy and race-based attacks that have become more and more common, sadly, throughout here in New Zealand and around the world. And so that's what I've been doing for the last 18 months, and I've got another semester to go. So next week I'll be going back to the capital, finishing that off, and then returning back to New Zealand full time. The whole point of it is to try and understand it, write a thesis, and it'll probably sit on someone's shelf and collect dust, but hopefully we'll gain a bit of knowledge out of that too. But I guess the biggest learning, and obviously there's the in-class learnings that you do while you're in the lecture theatres, but I guess the biggest learning, the whole point of the Fulbright program, is to try and bring those cultures together, to try and understand. Some of you may have gone to the US in recent years or decades gone by, and some of you may have never, but we always are bombarded by what's happening over there, what's being said, what's not being said. But I think there's very little nuance or understanding. I think mostly because it's such a hugely complex place, and there's only about a 20-minute news cycle left, right? So you have to try and pack it all in, and a 140-character tweet is all we get that'll dictate how that conversation takes place. So in a long way, the point of tonight's talk is to talk about the last 18 months in Washington, D.C., what I've seen, and some kind of key takeaways on a societal level. Obviously, that's what, and I'll use a few pictures along the way to describe what I'm talking about, all taken by me, all in the last 18 months from being on the streets of Washington, D.C. Like many of you, when I arrived in that city, I knew all I'd read and seen on TV and influenced by that. And I assumed I knew all there was to know. So, oh hell, there's some guy in the White House dictating everything, and everyone here's a lunatic, or everyone's here crazy. But once you arrive in DC, and I think DC is a fantastic microcosm of that country as a whole, you start to see everything that that country is experiencing in one little city right there. From its incredible wealth to its incredible poverty, from its, gilded and gated communities to its, for lack of a better word, these urban ghettos on the other side of the town. All divided vertically and horizontally along racial and ethnic lines as well. And everyone's just trying to get by, live together under one happy, as one happy family. And there's a huge focus on the United States of America. But the first thing I noticed is it is very, very fractured. I don't know if if that observation was made clear to me because I'm a foreigner, I've jetted in and I see it, or if people see it themselves, but because they're so desensitized to it, they either turn a blind eye or they just think, well, this is the way it's always been and this is the way it always will be. The DMV, which is the DC, Maryland, which is to the north, and Virginia to the south. The DMV area is about 6 to 6.5 million people, and it is the wealthiest metropolitan area in the country. So a lot of people think of boroughs of New York or Silicon Valley, but in terms of it's the wealthiest household income metropolitan area in the country, and that's a lot to do because there's a huge tech scene, obviously a massive government relations arm in there too, and obviously a huge military-industrial industry there as well. But at the same time, you go to a city like Baltimore, which most of you know from The Wire, and you have that sitting right next door as well. And you have, to put it very simply, DC is divided into 4 quadrants, north, south, east, and west. And when I was looking at apartments to find, everyone just said, hey man, I hope you're avoiding the south. And I didn't know what that meant until I arrived there, and it became very, very obvious. You take one metro stop further, and it's almost like you're in another country. So in terms of its poverty, its crime, its lack of infrastructure and investment into those communities. So to put it very simply, DC and the DMV area is a fantastic display of what we saw in 2020 with regards to social unrest, regards to the response to the pandemic, and also what happened in November and the 100 days or so following November. And that's what the next few pictures will show. So obviously that, hopefully you can see that, that was following the George Floyd, the death of George Floyd, the killing, the murder of George Floyd, and obviously we had about different estimates, but at least 100,000 people. Keep in mind, it's the middle of the pandemic, so most of those people are masked, all protesting afterwards. This was in the immediate days in early June, when you had a huge outpouring of emotion, when people thought, you know what, we've seen this before with other young black men who have been killed at the hands of police, but for some reason, everyone that I spoke to said, no, the energy's a little bit different. In 2016 and 15 and 14, before that, it used to be just black people that were marching out on the streets. But now you had an entire spectrum of people, black, white, young and old, all marching together in support. The mayor symbolically named this street Black Lives Matter Plaza, and this is the fence, and the White House is right here. So if Trump were to look out, you'd see all of that, but obviously he had a 10-foot wide fence put in place as well. A huge outpouring of anger, just resentment. But I think what I saw in the paper, both here, domestic coverage here in New Zealand and internationally, was everyone's looking for someone to blame. and they were like, well, it's Trump's fault. And that kind of, obviously there's some extent of truth in that, because, you know, he's not the best guy to, you know, when it comes to being a bit more nuanced and didn't have the right response. But what we saw there was just decades and decades and decades of anger coming out onto the street. And it doesn't just happen overnight. This is something that, you know, that has been building up and bubbling under the surface for so long. And because the video of George Floyd's death was so graphic, and obviously the internet means that half the world sees it within the day, there was a huge emotional response. As well as the emotional response, there was also quite the military response. So this was 2 or 3 days after the death, after the video went around. The first 48 hours, all the security was left to local police agencies such as Capitol Police or White House Secret Service or MPD, which is the local police force of the city, and they were completely overwhelmed. They didn't quite know what to expect, and in those first 2 or 3 nights, that's when you saw all the looting and all the burning and all of that happen overnight, to the point where then the National Guard was called in. So this is military police and the National Guard all come in, and they were hundreds, probably thousands out on the streets of DC. This is obviously in front of the White House, and every night it was almost like a battlefield. It was the most tense, it was almost like a war zone, in that the authorities were very prepared. Keep in mind, obviously, during the day, there's folks like us who go out on the streets all masked, and, you know, there's chants and rallies and parties in the street. And in the evenings, the people who were there lining up were the folks who came with batons and blowtorches and really just really let loose and make trouble. So there has to be a huge distinction made there where, you know, I saw it during the day, it'd be almost like a party atmosphere with music and all the rest of it. And then at night time, yeah, a whole lot of mostly black and white youth coming out ready with full armor, ready to go, just because, I guess, I don't know how you want to describe that. We'll come back to that. So this is what the streets of DC look like in the days after. Soldiers and checkpoints, that's Chinatown in DC, soldiers and checkpoints already. You know, this carried on for about 2 or 3 weeks until things calmed down. You know, I've traveled around the Middle East, and that's exactly what Kabul looks like, except the buildings are a little shorter. But that's exactly it. You know, you just had tanks and soldiers of all uniforms and all services just on every street corner, probably within 2 or 3 kilometers of the White House. And that's what it was like. The Black Lives Matter protests kind of reached a peak in August, when I think it was the 58th or 59th anniversary of Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech, and they organized a rally, Justice for George Floyd. I can't remember the actual name, it's quite long, but Justice for George Floyd rally, where they had a number of key speakers, and this was the National Mall, and obviously you've seen the famous picture of Martin Luther King standing there looking out. I think the estimate said about 100 to 200,000 people came by for this. It was quite a historic day. Boiling, middle of summer, August, about 30 to 35 degrees, so those masks didn't really help either. But nobody wanted to jump in the swimming pool. So that was that. After that, the Black Lives Matter protest kind of fizzled down. You didn't really hear much about it. And then that's when, around September onwards, you had obviously the Democratic candidate locked in, and then from September, October to November, about 10 weeks out, that's when rallying really got into a political rallying. Obviously the pandemic worsening by the day, social unrest, and now we're going into the full final swing of election season. And election season in the US looks like this. This was in the weeks leading up to election day. Obviously too close to call. Having learned from the Black Lives Matter protest, authorities didn't want to take any chances, so every shop was boarded up exactly like that for miles and miles around the White House and all around the CBD, and every street of DC pretty much looked exactly like this. You could bike around and all you see would be boards put up, you know, because if on the night, if it looked like Trump had won, then this would happen, or if it looked like Biden had won, then there'd probably be just as much of a reaction. So obviously we know what the election results were, or we do, I don't think some of us still but immediately after, obviously you saw in the news, immediately after November 4, there's a couple of days where, you know, nobody wanted to say that which state had gone which way, but 3-4 days later, November 7th, that's when they announced that Biden was the victor, and immediately, massive party atmosphere in DC. Keep in mind, DC itself is the most liberal or Democrat-friendly city in the country. I think it votes 90 to 95% in favor of the Democratic candidate. And so, massive party atmosphere all through the cities. But then immediately the following weekend, you had the first wave of protests that would lead up to the insurrection at the Capitol. And I was so surprised that this wasn't getting more media attention. I think somewhere around mid-November, late November, we had the first version of what they called the Million MAGA March. They all over social media, and I'm not talking about just Facebook or Instagram, you know, the mainstream social medias that you and I may use. There's a number of other channels which I guess as a student I'm plugged into, and you read these messaging boards, and there is a palpable anger from the Trump supporters who genuinely believe that the result was taken away from them. Not just kind of, man, I'm frustrated, let's go at it for 4 more years, but a genuine, strong, entrenched belief that something is afoot here, that the big mainstream media, the big tech, the many arms of the Democratic Party have collided and colluded to steal this election from us. And when I was reading coverage of it, much of the coverage was, oh, these guys are insane, they're lunatics, we can't believe them, you know, let's not give them any airtime. But every weekend, or every second or third weekend, this would happen on the streets of DC, where, you know, it started off small, a couple of thousand, then 10,000, then 20,000 every second or third weekend of Trump supporters all lining up. That's going up to the Capitol there, and the White House is about here. And it attracts everyone, from whatever you want to call it, moderate, conservative, traditional Republicans who call themselves patriots, to these guys, you know, who we might have seen or heard about in the news, the Proud Boys, you know, branded and called a white supremacist group who are in strong Trump supporters. You might have heard, or you might have remembered from that, the only debate where they went face to face, where he said, are you willing to condemn the Proud Boys? And he said, no, I don't condemn them. I said, stand by and stand back. And that was Trump's kind of little cue to say, you know, hold on until we'll see what happens with the results. So you had these guys marching up all through the streets of DC for weekends on end. And, you know, just to give them a flavor of what these guys are about, Kyle Rittenhouse did nothing wrong. Kyle was that the teenager in Kenosha, Wisconsin, who went and killed, I think, 2 or 3 protesters. Yeah. And so these are the kind of people who were in the streets of DC. And after the election, I think maybe editors in the newsroom wanted to say that, hey, look, the election's over, let's not give these guys too much voice. But what that in turn did was make them believe that they're against us. Why aren't they covering this? The fact that we've got thousands of them on the street like this. And every weekend it would grow bigger. You know, this the following weekend, I think this was the highest, just around early December, I think. Keep in mind, it's middle of winter, clear skies, but it was freezing. It's -5, -6 most days over there. You know, we'd have 10,000 easy, 20,000, I think at its highest, about 50,000 people attending rallies like this, to which Trump would either drive by and wave or go on the helicopter and wave, and that was kind of like their, you know, their leader giving them the signal. You know, just Trump flags everywhere. Stop the steal was a classic chant. A lot of MAGA hats everywhere. And so what was happening was, I thought this was bubbling up, and there's 2 ways that it would go about. One, it would naturally fizzle out, or it would reach a climax. And that's exactly what happened, which is what we saw the first weekend in January, which was when the final, the final numbers of the election were being ratified in Congress, and that was the last stand. And that's when he said, you know, we need to preserve our democracy, to which folks like these guys and the Proud Boys understood to be go and block that vote from happening in Congress. And we saw those ugly scenes and pictures happening. So I guess the key takeaway there was both, and I hate to use both of them in the one hand, is, you know, you had the social unrest building up over decades and decades, and then obviously it erupted in small fissures in 2014, 2016 with the likes of, the killing of Trayvon Martin and others, Michael Brown. But those were kind of localized. But what happened when we saw the George Floyd death was that was nationalized and international. It reached here as well. So that's one kind of element that, if left unaddressed, can come out onto the streets the way it did. And then this as well. These guys were either, cast aside or labeled as crazies or lunatics, and that just kind of fueled their fire to say that we're still here. Keep in mind that 70-something odd million Americans, after having seen Trump for 4 years, still voted for him. Right? And I think it would be a huge, huge generalization to say that all of them are in the same camp, right? So the key takeaway from that was, it's very easy for us to look at that, man, why can't they sort their shit out, right? But you have to understand how incredibly, incredibly complex it is. You just have to look at one city in DC and use that as the example for the entire rest of the country. 350 odd million people, 50 different countries, all trying to live together under one flag, under one roof. It's never been done before. So of course you're going to get that kind of division and lack of agreement. But I think what's made it even worse and so, impossible to reconcile is the fact that we're all living in our own little chambers, that we'll only watch or read news or commentary by people who agree with us. And obviously, in New Zealand that happens, but to a far lesser extent. Over there, the classic example was, I attended a college friend's Thanksgiving with family. And he said, hey, Russ, awesome, welcome to your first American Thanksgiving. Just one rule, man. So yeah, what's that? Don't talk politics. That's a classic rule in life to have, I guess. But what he meant by that was, he had families, family members would be coming from around the country who would be, conservative and very progressive or Democrat leaning. And once a year they all gather up and they try and avoid their very best to not talk about it. The very best. But obviously this Thanksgiving, 2 weeks after the election, it's the only thing that you can talk about. And so I sat there, watched these family members try their very best not to bring it up, and I said, how about that Trump, huh? No, but I sort of poked it a little bit, and the key takeaway there, it's just gotten so entrenched that different family members can't sit around the same table and try to speak eye to eye just like this, or have a decent meal because they know that Uncle so-and-so voted for Trump and Auntie over there voted for Biden. And it's just gotten that fractured. And I think what really hit it home for me was, obviously we had an election last year as well, and all through Zoom, through lockdown, I'll be catching up with friends from here, other Kiwi friends who are overseas, and we'll just be talking New Zealand politics and what do you think of this, what do you think of that, and it was such a refreshing change. All of us who ended up voting differently could just talk about the different policies and the different people, whereas over there it's almost like a no-go topic, or if you do, it ends up in fisticuffs. And sadly, that's the state of things. So when obviously the results were affirmed, Biden was the winner, I penned a little op-ed that I said, a lot of folks were saying, good riddance, and now we can, punch in all the changes that we want to make. And I thought, on the one hand, you have a few folks in Biden's camp who are very happy, 4 years, suck on that, and we'll just ram through all of these changes we want. But I think, I'm sure there are strategists within his party and within his administration who see that in order to, obviously Trump said make America great again, or in 2020 it was keep America great. In 2020, Biden's campaign was not as catchy, but it was a battle for the soul of the United States. And what he meant by that was, let's all come around together and talk about some of these issues. And I think that was a very tactful and very nuanced slogan, and that's been the theme of his administration. And I think that will continue to be the theme of it, because he's obviously what they call an established Democrat, someone who's been around, someone who knows how to bargain and make things happen. But on the other hand, you have some very entrenched Republicans who won't want to give up anything, and you also have someone on his left who will say, no, you've given up too much already. You need to ask for more. So some of my thoughts on the next administration is, I think there'll be less volume, just turning down the volume, a lot. You know, isn't it refreshing that we haven't heard anything? It's not like they're on holiday, they're still doing it stuff. He just doesn't tweet. It's fantastic. He's just turning down the volume and obviously just trying to make small victories day by day rather than punching through massive changes that are only going to get more blowback, so that come 2024, the Republicans or whoever they might be would just say, you know, they have the same response that the Democrats do. And so, there was a picture of the Capitol and a foggy day in DC, which I thought was very symbolic of the country. You know, that's 50 different flags all around one monument, but no end in sight. Who knows what's happening to the top? I'm trying to wrap up on a final note here. I guess, you know, to loop back into the very beginning, the whole point of the Fulbright program is that you go over there, you experience new cultures, and you try and you know, teach them a little bit about New Zealand. And the moment you open your mouth over there, it's like, oh, where are you from? And I'm like, oh, New Zealand. It's, oh my God, I love England. It's the best thing ever. Yeah. Okay, you know, so we have a fantastic reputation as a country overseas, and especially obviously during the pandemic. Next month will be exactly 1 year since the US went into lockdown, and it's still in lockdown. And so it was so refreshing when I got out of quarantine just before Christmas, just before New Year's, and to walk out of that hotel without a mask on, you know, I felt like I'd left my wallet somewhere. It's pretty cool. So we have a very, very lucky internationally Americans, and I think the rest of the world looks at us with some sort of jealousy and I guess some pride as well. I guess my one kind of, you know, grain of salt with that is there are so many Kiwis who are currently overseas who are trying to get home, and they just can't. I've spoken, so there was a Facebook group which was Kiwis Against Quarantine or some other catchy name, but you know, there are literally thousands of other Kiwis who are stuck overseas who can't come home, and I don't know what the process is for vaccination or the rollout of the MIQ or how long it'll be in place for, but you know, in that Facebook group you see a lot of people just saying my flights were cancelled, I have to pay hundreds and thousands of dollars, and I guess it just made me realise how incredibly fortunate we are to be here and to continue to support those who are overseas who are trying to get home as well. Thank you very much.
I think they liked it. Yeah.
That was good. You set the bar very low. Look, apparently we might have sound issues, but I will just walk through what we are seeing. This is a couple of videos. It's literally a 2-minute montage of some stuff that happened in DC, which I put together. So if we press play. So this is one of the Trump rallies, just to give you a sense of how many people there were. And this is in the morning as people are still arriving. I interviewed a few people, what they thought of him, which hopefully you might hear.
My name is Andy. I'm from Virginia, and I'm here for our president. He's still our president, and he will be for the next 4 years. Because they stole it from us, and we want it back. That's why I'm here.
Christine Smith. I'm here from New Jersey. I'm here today to stand up for the same institutions that guarantee us free election and fair elections.
Hey, I'm Amber Nicole Miller. I'm from Huntington Beach, California. I'm here because I support our president 100%. He is a huge human trafficking supporter, and he has been human president.
So this is the Proud Boys. So they come dressed in battle fatigues.
Let's say 4 more beers.
As I said, kind of tense, but you know, like
Just to show you that it's not just white people who support Donald Trump.
It matters, and it should matter whether or not I support, you know, President Donald Trump or Joe Biden. You know.
They're brave. Obviously, driving through there, you get a lot of heckles going through DC with that on. She's my favorite.
Number one, I love him. I
Our black citizen friends. So you know, just to hammer the point home that you know, these people, that's their view of America. That's the way they live in it. For us, it's crystal clear because we're looking at it from the outside in. When you've been there, you've grown up there, you see the country change before your eyes. You know, it's and you obviously just watch Fox News, or even to the right of Fox News, Newsmax.
To the right of Fox News.
That's
the other boondocks.
Yeah, that's their circles. And then you ask someone, you know, who's just consumes left-wing media, and that's their view of America. So I'm so happy and so proud that obviously we don't live in those. I mean, we do, but not to the same extent. So something that I'm always conscious of is, am I being surrounded by people who only speak the same language and talk the same points as me? Or am I being challenged? And that's something I think that we should all focus on. The beauty about the security studies program at Georgetown is that, you know, many, sorry to take the mic away, I'm not used to that, Gary. The beauty about the security studies program at Georgetown is that it's one of the few programs, I guess, at an elite institution where you get a decent balance of progressive thinkers and conservative thinkers all in class, face to face, or now online, talking about it. So you have some traditional and some current and former serving men and women who bring in their very that mindset, and then you have some urban elites who come in and say, no, this is how it should be. Whereas I feel like a lot of higher education in the US is all kind of one-track mind now, and so that's something we should be conscious of as well. Just listening into the other side. Obviously, you don't have to agree it, but at least having that conversation. And you know, something I'm very mindful of in my social media interactions, face to face, and also just, you know, sitting around for a halal beer.
Right, Dave.
Can I have the microphone, or I can just speak here? No. I suspect something all the people here would like to know, and I think a lot of people in the West would like to know, and I'd like to hear your opinion on this. How is it possible in an era of wall-to-wall social media, where you can know anything by 2 clicks on your computer, did the US authorities, and I'm thinking of the security in particular, not know what was coming on the 6th of January? Now, either there was a conspiracy or they're bloody idiots. It cannot be anything in between. You can't tell me the CIA did not have fingers in the FBI into chat groups, Proud Boys. Were they totally stupid, or were they complicit in allowing that to happen?
That's a really good question. Thank you. That's a really good question, and something that's going around both in our classrooms and obviously all through the White House as well. I think there's a fantastic side-by-side picture put together of, obviously, and I showed it as well, that the response to the protests, the Black Lives Matter protests, which was just every man who could wield a gun would go out on the streets of DC, you know, or a gun in a uniform. Whereas in those weekends leading up to January the 6th, the insurrection at the Capitol, I was just astounded that this was building up for weeks and weeks and weeks. And either Capitol Police, which was the only security force that was at the Capitol, it's literally just, you know, probably half a dozen guys who just walk around the Capitol building. There's no fencing, it's open to the public, and sadly that will no longer be the case. They've said they'll erect a permanent fence. I think it's a bit of both, in that they really didn't expect insurrection or a riot to take place. They thought these guys are serious, they'll shout, they'll scream, they might throw things, but they'll never actually storm inside the building. So there was a bit of naivety from the security forces, I think, who just weren't prepared, and they thought, yeah, that might be the case, but do we really need to pull in a few hundred more troops? And they obviously in the end decided no. But I think, you know, the bigger intelligence agencies like the CIA and the FBI, who are in charge of these things, they'll be looking at what alarm bells did they miss. Sure, they did make some arrests. Some of the leaders of the Proud Boys did get put on house arrest or detained in the days leading up to that weekend or that day. But I think definitely, as we saw, more could have been done. So that's something that I think the Biden administration will get to the bottom of, and also a subject of the second impeachment as well. Obviously, Trump's out of the White House, but his impeachment trial will continue. I think that's one of the questions to be answered. Yeah.
Good to see you. Thank you again. Great to see you. Do you want me to use the mic?
You got such a quiet voice.
Yes, I have such a quiet.
He's elderly.
I'm a vulnerable person. Like many of us over here, I've been glued to CNN and The Guardian. So I guess that shows that I've been very much moulded in a particular view. CNN is extraordinary in terms of its very clear perspective on what's gone. And I guess you just talked about the impeachment. I mean, there's a whole lot going on there. Have you got a view to share with us about how you're seeing that unfolding and where it's going to go? I mean, it sounds like he's not going to be impeached, but has this been a process? It seems to me like this had to happen, and yet at the same time, it says what was the point and all that kind of stuff. Have you got a view on that?
I think the second impeachment is it'll be a delicate balance for this new government, this new administration. I think they'll want to show that they're taking it seriously and they're going to respond to the insurrection swiftly and hardly. But at the same time, I think they also, they're new into the White House. They don't want to bring him back into the spotlight and that be the determining or the event that takes up the most amount of media space in their first 100 days. So they'll find a delicate balance between wanting to show that they're taking action, but at the same time not wanting to give him more and more media attention. I think there's been some fracas and some talking around which congresswoman or sits on which committee. So there's been a bit about that, and it just seems like, the inauguration, big hurrah, and then back to the same stuff, back to the same kind of, we're Republican and you're Democrat and we're not going to agree on anything. So I guess any new administration just has to say, is this a battle worth fighting, or can we just leave it? Because at the end of the day, I don't think much will come out of it. He'll just have 2 strikes against his name instead of 1, and that'll be the end of that. I think to go beyond your question, what happens to Trump after, or now that he's out of the office, will be the biggest question for the next election cycle, because he still wields incredible influence. And so whether he throws his hat in the ring again in 4 years' time, or whether he doesn't formally announce a candidacy but continues to just throw barbs and throw spanners in the works for the Democrat and the Republican nominee in 2024, that'll continue to be the case. Looks like he might go into media, so a competitor to Fox News. So all of that is likely. Regardless, I don't think we've seen the last of him or heard from him. Yeah.
Oh, sorry. We normally do have another one.
Thank you. I've just come back from living 4 years in the US, in Colorado, where my daughter lives. And I'm curious about your take on a number of observations that I had. The area where my daughter lived in Colorado, between Boulder and Denver, it was a fairly affluent area and highly educated people. And I spent some time working in the local supermarket for a variety of reasons. And I found this huge discrepancy between the people in the community where my daughter lived, highly educated, and they could see the rhetoric that was coming from Trump, although in saying that, they also had the view of politics is corrupt. I like Trump's policies. I don't like him as a man. The second thing I found was the people I worked with in the local supermarket were primarily uneducated. They were absolute staunch Trump supporters. You could not have a conversation with them about anything to do with politics or Trump or the Republican, I could not believe the vitriol and the way in which they would talk, and I learnt very quickly not to have those conversations. My third observation is I have a friend who lives in Alabama, highly intelligent, brought up as a Republican, and we had lots of conversations about Trump before the election. And I felt in our conversations that she had leaned towards voting Democrat, and I see by her posts on social media now, she absolutely bought into Trump's rhetoric. And there's a part of me that believes that in the South, particularly Alabama, that their leanings towards Democrat or Republican very much had to do with how they were brought up. And it just was beyond me how in New Zealand we can have this incredible conversation, as you said, but there you cannot. And there was a part of me that found it quite scary in terms of the way that people thought about politics. But the other thing that came through in the conversations that I had, and I wondered what your opinion of this was, they absolutely believed that any kind of social policies like we have in New Zealand is communism, and I'm not going to support that. What are your thoughts around my observations?
Thank you. That's a really good question. So there would be, like I said, in that picture of the people, marching in that Million Mega March, that wasn't just the people who make the loudest noise or whatnot. There were, highly educated, highly affluent people who were there, who you might call traditional Republicans or traditional conservatives, who like his policies. They love his policies. They love his pro-business. That's the only thing I think he had. They love his pro-business, and I guess this nationalistic voice that he had, because they feel that America is on the decline, and here's our man who's going to carry us off into the future. And I can proudly beat my chest and say I'm an American, I'm a patriot. I can wave the stars and stripes without feeling guilty about anything. But on the other side, you do have others who also support Trump, but they don't give a damn about his policies. It's more, he's just fed them this garbage of you're the real victim here, that so-and-so who's coming over from overseas has come to take your jobs, that the decline of manufacturing and industry that that your parents grew up on and they lived on, that's all because of the establishment class, and the Democrats are part of it, and Joe Biden's been in there for 46 years and he's part of the problem, and so he just keeps feeding this narrative that I'm the savior, and I guess that's a tactic that not he employed very, very well, but other candidates before him had done as well. But to your point about this underbelly or this underclass of folks who have felt left behind, if you leave the cities and so here's DC, here's Virginia. If you drive an hour out into West Virginia, it's almost like you've traveled back in time to the 60s and 70s. In terms of their infrastructure, in terms of the way people talk, their culture, everything. It's almost like they've been left behind the times. When the hollowing out of manufacturing, particularly in those, the Rust Belt states, when that happened due to globalization and all those jobs left to either go to the cities or highly educated folks or overseas, the men and women who are now reaching, who are obviously of voting age, they saw their parents grow up in affluence, and they saw their parents being able to raise, kids on a fantastic house and a fantastic union job, and now all of that's gone. And then Trump's here to say that, well, that's all part of the establishment class, that they've taken this away from you. And so there's a little bit where some people know, they can see through his rhetoric that this guy isn't much substance, but I like the other guy even less so. And then there are others who probably don't have the critical thinking or the analytical skills to be able to see through those words and say, actually, there's nothing here for us. To your final point about having that conversation. You know, I'm glad most of you understand how important it is that we can just sit around and talk to someone we don't agree with and still share a beer at the end of the day. It just doesn't happen over there without it being either sometimes violent, or sometimes just you just won't get a proper response from some people. And a perfect experiment would be, you know, one of the early contenders for 2024 is this guy called Tucker Carlson, who is one of the Fox News' premier anchors. And if you watch, you know, one of his nightly shows, you get amped up of how you're the victim here, and everyone else who has more than you, or everyone else who's more educated than you, is the person that's victimizing you. And you watch that on end. Here's the most, you know, highly rated, or gets the most number of viewers, you know, every night of the week, 4 nights a week. Incredibly influential. And, you know, tens of millions of families will tune into his primetime show every night, and he'll be fed this stuff. And so once someone's been watching that since a kid, and now they're 30, 40, whatever, and you try to have a conversation about it, it's like, no, you're wrong. So it talks about that kind of echo chamber of opinion, and something we have to be incredibly mindful of. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much. This is very hard to turn all of this into a question, but it won't be too long. I'm an American. I came here in 1971, so I hold 2 passports now. And I've not wasted, but I've spent a lot of my life over the last year and a half reading multiple websites, following this election, and praying and hoping every day that Trump would be impeached. And here he is starting a second impeachment trial. Tomorrow morning we'll get the news on that. But what I wanted to ask you, and this relates to William Fulbright, who set up the Fulbright scholarship system. Now it seems to me that in the days when that was done, America was sort of a shining beacon to the rest of the world, you know, emerging from World War II. And there was this sense of largesse as the United States helped countries here, there, and everywhere recover. And I think Americans fell into they actually began to believe the crap that they're told about individualism, Trump's, pardon the word, collectivism, individual freedom, Trump's a safe, humane society, capitalism, the toxic brand of capitalism that's spread throughout the Western world now, was the only way to organize financial matters in the world. So there are a number of these principles that at that time, they were taught and told and grew up believing completely. And as I say, after the war, Fulbright set up this wonderful scheme, I think, and you benefited from it. I think just listening to you, and other people from the States go abroad under Fulbrights. Now, my question has to do with the Fulbright scheme. I have this idea that if anybody elected to a national political position in the United States had to undergo a sort of modified Fulbright scholarship. They were given a 1-year assignment in any country overseas on a subsistence salary, and they had to go and live for 12 months under the conditions that exist in another society. America would have a much, much better, more humane and more effective political system. So coming back to my question to you is, of what use is the Fulbright system to people like yourself going to the States, seeing this crumbling giant of an economy, of a society, but those are my words, of course, seeing that when there probably should be far more Americans being sent abroad to see what life is like for by far the majority of people in the world.
That's a really good question. I think to answer in different parts, what have I gained from it? I think you know, you're right. In times past, it would have been that you know, that shining beacon, that city upon a hill, or whatever you want to call it. That was a reputation that America might have had, but in recent years, and particularly the last 4, you know, it's not looking that great, is it? You know, when you say someone, I'm going to study in college in the United States, people say, oh, really? Why would you want to be doing that? Whereas in decades and years before, we've been, oh, that's awesome, that's fantastic. You know, go learn some things and perhaps bring them back. You know, now I have to caveat, you know, if someone says, why did you go there? Well, it's, you know, to learn how to do things, and in many cases, to learn how to not do things as well. And that's sadly, unfortunately, the case over there. I think you're exactly right in that if more folks who are in positions of power do see other systems of government and other structures of society, they'll be enriched for it. I think to the previous lady's point about Colorado, there's a particular congresswoman there who has just applied for a permit. DC has very strict firearms laws for obvious purposes, and she has just filed a permit to open carry, which is she wants to be the first congresswoman in, I think, a century or so to carry a firearm around the streets of DC and into her workplace. And that's kind of representative of the area that she's from, right? But if she were to obviously go to another state even, not even another country, and see that actually not everyone thinks like me, then perhaps she wouldn't be so so strong in her viewpoint on that. To your question in the previous one as well, I think Americans particularly look at foreign programs as communism. You know, they look at probably what we have here with the equivalent of Medicare for all, whatever they want to call it. You know, our ACC system, our healthcare education system has some level of communism, and they're incredibly scared of that. Not because someone's able to elaborate a really strong answer for it, but rather more what they've been fed from day to day about this, like you said, this toxic capitalism of individualism versus collectivism, that, the American dream, you can do it, you can't be feeding everyone else and all that stuff. So I don't think that's going to go away anytime soon. But to answer your question and end on a brighter note, I was very, during last year, particularly when I saw the incredibly poor response to the pandemic, the social unrest, obviously all the protests happening after the election, I was a little, thought, wow, really? Incredible country, it's been around 250 odd years, and now this is how it all ends. But I thought, I was reminded that this has never been done before in history, where so many people come together under this, ideal of democracy and trying to live together and all under one banner. And if America as a country was one continent, it'd splinter off into 10, 12 different countries, right? You might have the Northeast elite, and then you'll have the Midwest, and you'd have the South, and you'd have the Northwest, all its own little countries. And now that, obviously there is some talk of secession and that potentially, happening. But, everyone is, so to end on a bright note, there is some kind of, I don't know what you want to call it, misplaced or righteous optimism there. I haven't lived there long enough to know whether it's well placed or not, but it is carrying on very, very strongly underneath all of this.
Right, now I'm going to ask the last question. There's lots of questions, and you'll have to come and ask them yourself. I want to ask a question because it's just over an hour. I want to ask a question as a young man that grew up in this city, and you're in the Fulbright scholarship. How can Christchurch learn from your Fulbright scholarship?
That's a really, really good question. I think there are a number of programs to try and bring in folks from overseas, or actually from other parts of the country here, to try and get a little bit of a startup scene, an academic scene, a literary scene, an arts scene going up in Christchurch. What can Christchurch learn, or what was the question exactly? What can Christchurch learn? I think
from your experience.
From my experience, I think Christchurch is uniquely placed. Obviously, we've been in the national and international spotlight for the last decade, for obvious reasons. And it's interesting when I said I'm from Christchurch, a number of Americans would say, "Oh, that's the earthquakes," or sadly in my class, a lot of them like, "Isn't that where the attacks happened?" And so you got to be mindful of how other people perceive your city versus how you perceive the city yourself. As locals and as residents of this great city, it has a lot going for it, and so it's really, I guess, up to us in how we want it to shape out and what the future that we want to have. I think to answer your point about what we can learn, I saw a lot of heads nodding in agreement that perhaps we should be open to listening into people's who have different opinions to us. And I think where I can't bring up any numbers to support this, but I feel as if we're less demographically diverse than other cities in New Zealand. And so, when it comes to having those courageous conversations about the future of the city or what we want it to look like or feel like or breathe like, then just being open to having that conversation rather than feeling a little closed off. That's not to say that I have the answers for what I want it to look like or feel like, but at least just being open and honest about having this conversation rather than, pushing it away. That's
Sure.
I just find it inspiring to see my mate. He's so bloody impressive. And I pose the question, how many kids like Abbas drowned on their way to attempting freedom? How many kids have we rejected as a country because we're all right, mate? And I think that, if you look at this impressive brain and you look at this impressive young man, and the world's his oyster, and he stands up here and says, I'm a Kiwi. And we should all be proud of the fact that our Prime Minister of the time, Helen Clark, sent her Minister of Immigration, Leanne Dalzell, to negotiate with the Australians to actually get Abbas and hundreds of people from their ship into this country, and boy, what wonderful citizens they are. So Abbas, thank you very much. We love you.